So if you watch part 1 of this series, you'll see where we removed this engine from our CJ7. Now this is not the original 4.2 litre that the CJ7 came with. This is a 4 litre engine from a 2000-2001 XJ. It is very much the same as the Wrangler's 4 litre engine. The big difference between the original 4.2 is that it was carbureted, and we decided to go with a fuel injected engine. So whether you're doing a teardown for a 4 litre XJ or a 4 litre Wrangler, or even the 4.2 that originally came in the CJ7, the process is going to be very, very similar. So let's get cracking and pull this engine apart. So what we're going to do today is we're going to remove the wiring harness first. That'll give us access to get into the fuel rail. We can take out the injectors, and then we're going to take out the intake manifold and the exhaust manifold that's underneath it. So I'm going to get going with that and start by removing these components. Alright, so the clips for these two injectors have broken, so I'm going to use a screwdriver to go underneath and lift up the tang so that I can pull these two connectors off these injectors. We used compressed air to blow away any loose dirt and debris before we continued. Alright, so we've got the fuel rail out. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bag all the injectors with their O-rings into their own bag, so we know that none of those get lost over there, and then we'll bag all of these components together so that when we want to reassemble, we know that we've got all the right fittings together here. And I'll label these here so that we can put them back where they need to go. This is the fuel rail, intake manifold, That way I'll know that we have all the right parts together when we need to reassemble this. Alright, now on with the manifolds. Right, the next thing I'm going to remove is the intake and exhaust manifolds. So I'm going to remove these shared bolts here at the top and at the bottom. I'm going to leave for now these two over here. They hold the exhaust manifold on, so these two will be the last I do. However, I'm going to give them a squirt of PB Blaster just to make it easier to remove them when the time comes to get them out, as they are studs. So let's go ahead and get these out. Alright, with all the shed bolts now removed, I can take off the intake manifold. Right, so this bolt is a little bit stuck. I'm going to use my center grip here. Hopefully I can get this off without snapping it. There we go. So the next parts that I'm going to remove are all the accessories on the front here. I'm going to take out the water pump, the thermostat,
the alternator, and then I'll remove this pulley over here so that I have access to the front of the engine. The original bolt used on the alternator had been replaced with a longer one, and I decided to cut it shorter with the angle grinder. After cutting the bolt shorter, I used a file to remove any burrs, and once the bolt was out, I chamfered it on the bench grinder. Right, so we've got the puller installed now on the harmonic balancer. Just a tip, make sure you thread these bolts all the way through the harmonic balancer. What you don't want to have is that the pulley strips out and these bolts pull out, leaving the balancer behind. So I've threaded these all the way through, but not too deep because you don't want to damage this cover either. So these bolts are threaded through and the puller is set up. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use my socket over here and a wrench over there, and we will pull this balancer off. Alright, so the harmonic balancer is off. You'll see here that we made sure that those studs struck through far enough. But you'll also note on this housing over there, there, and there, that the previous time that this pulley was pulled off, those studs were driven too deep and they actually damaged this aluminum casing. So just make sure that you don't drive them too deep and damage this casing. You'll also see that there's an oil seal there, so we'll make sure that we replace that oil seal so we don't have a leak going forward. Alright, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to remove the head. So I'm going to undo all of the rockers that are over there, and then remove the push rods that are at the back as the next thing, and then I will undo the head. So let's get started with that. Right, so while we're disassembling, you can see that this valve spring sits a little bit higher than the others, and if you look up top here, you'll see the little keeper, that little half ring that should be in there to keep the valve onto the spring is missing. In fact, you'll see there's a piece of it down there, and the other piece of it is all the way down there. So this engine was at high RPM when it started missing. I suspect we had some valve bounce and we have dropped a valve. So at least now we've found one thing wrong during our teardown, so we know how to get this fixed. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my little magnet on a stick to make sure we don't drop that little piece of that keeper in. So you'll see got that first piece out there and the second piece from over there. So that's the one half. The other half is still missing somewhere, so we got to keep looking until we find the other half of the keeper. Alright, so as we took out the rockers and the push rods, I've laid them out in the order that I took them out. So I can now just label them and then put them away to keep them for reassembly when I need them. Alright, so on each of the push rods, we've put a little tape on with the number, so I know in which order they go. And then on the rocker arms, you'll see I have numbered each one of them, so I know where they all go. So we're able to bag all of these now before we pull the head off. Alright, so if you follow the service manual for this Jeep head, it's going to tell you that you need to start torquing the bolts from this one over here, and you're going to torque in a circular pattern moving outwards as you go along, like this. So we're going to use this torque pattern from the service manual. However, we're going to do it in reverse. What we're going to do is we're going to start with this bolt over here, and we're going to loosen in a circular pattern moving in, and the last one that we will loosen will be this one over here. So what I'm going to do is to do this in steps. I'm going to use my breaker bar, and I'm just going to loosen this bolt, this one, and then I'll move in that circular pattern, and then just use the impact to finally remove them.
The torque section of the stud holding the dipstick support broke off, even with heat on it. I used a nut to tighten the stud into the head and was then able to back it out.
Right, now that we've got the head bolts out and everything removed, we're going to lift the head off and see what it looks like underneath the head. Right, here we go. So we have just lifted it so that we know that the head is loose. And now what we're going to do is we're going to just lift it right off like that. Alright, this head is the famous 0331 head, which we know is prone to cracking. So I'm not so happy about that, but it is what it is. It is not a TUPY head, which has got some of the upgrades in it. So we will have to send this head in to have it checked for cracks. Alright, so with the head flipped on its side, you'll see that this is the one where the valve dropped, and that light kiss of the piston over there. So we did make just slight contact. This valve is completely stuck now, so I don't know if maybe the valve stem is bent, but the rest of the valves look okay. Alright, so if we take a look at the block over here, you'll see that this piston here where the valve dropped has made an indentation where the valve contacted the head of the piston. You can see it over there. And there's a little bit of a bump over there. So we did have the valve just kiss the head of the piston, but fortunately did not drop all the way in. Right, the next thing that we need to do is to remove the timing chain cover, which is over here. We will need to pull the camshaft out so that we can get the cam bearings done. As I said, this engine did have low oil pressure when it was at warm idle, so we want to make sure that we get in to get to these cam bearings. Alright, we've taken out all the bolts. We now need to remove the oil pan to get this cover off. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip the engine over and then remove the oil pan from underneath. Well, guess what? I forgot to remove the hydraulic lifters. So when I turned the engine over, they all started falling out. Now these are supposed to be matched to the push rods. So you're supposed to take them out in the right order, and there is no way that I will find this order again. So I'm probably going to have to put a new set of lifters in. But if you are taking the engine apart, don't forget to take those out before you flip the engine over. Right, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove the oil pump. We're going to remove the girdle so that we can get to the crankshaft over here. We're also going to take out our timing chain sprockets, which are these two sprockets here. You'll note that I have aligned the timing marks here just so that I can check the timing was right before we take it out over here. And where we really need to get to is to remove the camshaft, which is behind this bolt over here. Right, so what we need to do now is slide the sprockets off as a unit. So we'll slide the one and then we'll slide the other. And they're fairly tight, but they do slide off. plate. Right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to undo these two bolts here and press out each of these pistons. Now before I do that, I'm going to mark each of the caps to make sure that the cap and the rod remain a matched set, as well as the direction, so that it is to the front each time, so that when we reassemble we can make sure we put it in the right direction and match the caps to the rod. Alright, so I used my engraving tool to engrave arrows onto each one of these caps so that I know which way around the cap goes in. I also engraved the cylinder number onto this little pad over here on each one of them, so I can make sure that the right piston goes into the right bore. The main bearing caps over here each have their number printed on them, so as long as I am on this side of the engine when I reinstall, I'll be able to match up and make sure I can read both of those numbers from this side so that I know I can't get them wrong. Now I chose to use my engraving tool to engrave this. Some people use a punch to punch it. I just feel that the engraving tool is less aggressive on the engine and I don't want to bend or damage anything, so I think the engraving tool will work just fine. There is another way that you can also take a look at these numbers. Each one of them have a 2-digit number code printed on this side of the engine over here. So you could also record the number code and make sure you put them in the right way around. For me, I prefer just to use this number over here, because then I know I haven't got it wrong and I didn't record it incorrectly. So now that I've got them all marked, I can go ahead, I can undo these two bolts, and then I will press the cylinders out to the bottom. But before I do that, I'm going to flip this block over and just gently treat the edges of the cylinder wall so that they are easy to press out. Right, so we have all the pistons out. You can see there's some wear on the edges of the pistons over here. This one here has got a fairly bad mark inside of it here. So does that one over there. What's more concerning to me is if you look on the inside of these bearings, what you'll see is these wear marks over here. And that indicates that the bearings have actually worn through the oil layer and made contact with the journals. And if we go and have a look at the journals, you will see that there's some damage on the journals. So I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it on the camera, but if you look over here, you will see these marks, and if I run my fingernail across them, I can feel them catching on my fingernail. Same as over here, there's those marks, and I can catch my fingernail on them. And that's an indication that this journal has been damaged. I think this one is probably the worst one over here. You might also be able to see this one over here. So definitely some damage on the journals there, and that will be a direct result of that low oil pressure that we saw. Right, so with the pistons out, we now need to undo these caps and remove the caps so that we can take the crankshaft out. So we're going to get going with that. Right, so here we have the main bearings, and you'll see that they have these like lines inside of them over here, and they correspond to wear patterns over there. And if I rub my nail on them, I can feel those wear lines over there. You might actually see my nail getting hooked in that one over there. So there's definitely some wear on these journals. This one over here is an interesting one. It's got this very bad wear line over here, and it stops, and you can actually see a little particle sitting right there. So again, you've got this very bad wear line where that particle was sitting. So that one there is actually quite bad, and all of the others have some form of wear on them. This one over here, actually quite a lot on this one over here. So I'm going to get somebody who knows a little bit more than I do to have a look at this and advise me. But the way I see it, I think we're going to need to have this crank ground. Alright, so the last thing I need to remove is this camshaft over there. So in order to do that, I'm going to take out the sensor over here. I'm going to remove all my oil pressure sensors and the oil filter. This sensor here has got gears that are engaged with the camshaft. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of that next.
Right, with everything removed, I'm just going to slide out this camshaft. Just be careful not to scratch the journals, so I'll lift it up. I might remove it. Right, there we go. Camshaft is out.
So there's some very interesting wear on this cam bearing. I don't know if the camera can show it, but over here it looks almost like some impurities have come out through this oil port and have been worn out in like a V pattern away from that oil port over there. So there's definitely some damage on that cam bearing over there. Alright, so the one measurement that Jeep requires you to take on any cylinder block is to measure the bore diameter and check for ovality. So what you have to do is measure the distance from side to side, like this, as well as front to back. And then you look for a difference, being that this dimension will usually be a little bit larger than the side dimension because the lateral forces on the piston have worn the bores to a slight oval. The tool that you use is a bore gauge. It has this little arm on it and these two little wheels at the back. And what you do is you slide the bottom in like this, and then you rock it backwards and forward. The top of the gauge, you're able to take a measurement, which we'll take over here, and we will then check what the diameter of the bore is in this direction, and then we will turn it 90 degrees like this, and we will take a dimension across here. Now if you go and look at the service manual, what it says is that distance may not be more than 0.025 of a millimeter, and this is straight out of our service manual. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure all of these up and then compare them to the service manual. Alright, so we've used the bore gauge to measure for the out of round on the bores, and you'll see here that we are well outside of the spec. So according to the service manual, we will need to bore these cylinders out and then have them rehoned again and go to an oversized piston. So that's unfortunate, but the way it is with an older engine.
Alright, so we've got the teardown complete. We've got the block, the head and the crankshaft that we're going to take into our local machine shop and let them tell us what they think. I strongly suspect that we're going to have to hone out the cylinders and grind the crank, and then the head obviously needs to be redone. So we're going to get that done, and then we'll start reassembling this engine.
So as I was getting ready to take the parts to the machine shop, I was wondering how I was going to transport this crankshaft. Now I was worried that if I put it in the back of the Jeep, it was going to roll around and get damaged. So what I decided to do was to take two 2x4s on a plank of wood, and I've cut a V groove into the 2x4s on each side and laid the main bearing surface, or the main journal, into the V groove on each side. That will prevent it from rolling around. I think it's pretty firm, and I'm comfortable doing it this way. Now some of you will say you can't lay a crankshaft on its side. I don't believe it's going to cause any damage, and it hasn't been machined yet. So I'm going to take it like this and load it up. Alright, so loaded up in the back of the very saggy XJ, I've got our crankshaft, our pistons and rods, the head, and our block. So we're going to take this to our machine shop and let them tell us what they think we should do next. So we're here at Hurley Engine Services, where we're going to have our machining done on our engine. So let me get inside and get these parts unloaded. So I'm here with Jason from Hurley Engine Services, and he's going to tell us what we need to do to repair this engine.
So you want me to just tell you, we're going to bore and hole in the block.
Okay.
We're going to open up the rear water jackets to match the gasket for water flow. We'll replace R&R the cam bearings and freeze plugs. We're either going to turn your crankshaft, or we might have a new one we can swap out for it.
Perfect.
And then we'll fix your bent valve. We'll do a 3-angle valve job. And then we'll open the water jackets on the back of the head to match the block.
That's awesome.
For the water flow.
All right, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
We would like to give a special shout out to Jason from Hurley Engine Services for all their advice and help with the machine work on this engine. We'll leave their details in the comments if you wish to contact them. Make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss the episode where we reassemble this engine.